team reasoning is a development of game theory that has recently been of much interest to philosophers thinking about joint action. Now, there are three things that you ought to do if you want to understand team reasoning. You need to know, first of all, what it is. Then you need to have a sense about what it might tell you about aggregate agents, if anything. And thirdly, you might want to know how it could be used or not used in constructing a theory of shared agency or of attacking others' theories of shared agencies. What I'm going to do in this section is just cover that first thing. What is team reasoning? Later sections will take things up further. So here is, in bare essence, a statement of what team reasoning is due to one of its inventors, Michael Bacharach, who I suppose you'd call a philosopher or an economist. So he says somebody team reasons if she works out the best possible feasible combination of actions for all of the members of her team and then does her part in it. So Bacharach. Now I'll come back to this later and I'll try to explain a bit more clearly what this is. But let us first go to this game HighLow in order to try to get a sense of what team reasoning is supposed to do for us. So if you take a look at Bacharach's book, you don't need to for this, but he actually starts with this game and uses it to motivate introducing team reasoning. And so I'm following him in doing that. Now, what you know about this game already, I hope, if you've got this far in the course, is that there is not one Nash equilibrium, but rather two Nash equilibria. This is a second Nash equilibrium. Why is this a second Nash equilibrium? Well, suppose that you've got this as a combination of actions. The player X cannot unilaterally improve her position by going high. She has to stick with low. If she goes high, it will make things worse for her. Hers are the yellow preferences. And likewise for player Y. Player Y cannot unilaterally improve her position either. Now, what's striking when you've got these two Nash equilibrium is that in general, game theory is going to have nothing at all to tell you about why one is preferred to another. And in fact, there's a very good reason why game theory can't tell you that this is the bad Nash equilibrium and that's the good one, although I guess most people watching this are likely to think exactly that. Why would you go low when you could go high? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. So many people think. And in fact, many people, when they play this game, do indeed choose high. So suppose we try to put ourselves in the perspective of the standard game theory, right? What we need to think here is this. We want to work out what the player X should do. Should they go high or low? And the answer is, well, it depends on what that player expects Y to do. So if you, as player X, expect Y to choose high, then go high. But if you expect Y to choose low, then you should go low. All right, that's fine. So let's work further in this standard game theory, rational choice theory, decision theory paradigm. What do we expect Y to do? Well, in order to work out what we expect Y to do, we have to think about what's rational for Y to do. But what Y should do depends on what Y expects you as X to do, right? It's clear enough, isn't it? Right? The situations are symmetric. What this means, of course, is that what you should do depends on what Y expects you to do. And if you follow through this pattern of reasoning, you can see, as Sugden says, that we have entered an infinite regress. What is rational for a player in a situation like X is to do depends on what it's rational for a player in a situation like X is to do. And this is why there's no way, when we're using standard resources of game theory, to determine that you ought to play high or that rather than to play low. Those two things look equally good from the point of view of standard game theory. Now, I haven't fully explained why we enter Sugden's infinite regress here, so it might well be that you just need to stop and do a little think about this. You can also, if you need to, have a look at the 2000 paper cited just below this by Sugden if you need to work this out. It's not critical that you see it for yourself, so if you're prepared to accept it, if you're a trusting kind of person, that's okay too. But if you're curious, it's something that's well worth thinking about, because once you get the infinite regress, you've seen something really interesting about the limits of game theory, something that Bacharach in effect wrote an entire book about. Alright, so what I've said so far is that in a game like HighLow, there are two Nash equilibria, and moreover, standard tools of game theory provide us with no reason to prefer high over low. What Bacharach further says is, look, you can play around with various clever ideas like salience and other things, but you still won't get an explanation of why it would be rational to pick high over low. So this turns out to be quite a deep problem. On the face of it, it looks initially potentially quite superficial. That's what I thought when I first saw it, but it turns out to be quite an interesting and a deep one. Moreover, says Bacharach, high-low situations, games like this, are absolutely pervasive in everyday life. And I won't go through that now because time is short, but if you have a look at chapter 1 of that book, you will see that I think he goes through 8 or 9 everyday situations involving things like, meeting people, picking up parents and so on, which look like high-low situations. Also, this game is sometimes called the footballer's problem, where footballers may have a choice between 2 different pathways they can take. So why is this interesting to us? Well, I hope you're thinking that it seems obvious that you should choose high, that there's something kind of irrational about choosing the low option if you're faced with a high-low game. Right? At least many people do find that that's true. But Bacharach says the question is, why is that obvious? Why is that obvious? And what you can see is that we don't get the explanation from standard bits of game theory. And the other thing we need to explain, here's the second question, why do people almost always choose high? So Bacharach. So we've got 2 things to explain about this problem. And we know that it's a worthwhile problem if we agree with Bacharach that these high-low situations are pervasive. And as I've already said, Bacharach is very clear and goes into some detail about this. Again, you can follow that up if you want to, that trying to tweak around the standard bits of game theory by invoking salience or some kind of optimization added principles, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Either the solutions are not general enough, or they generate incorrect predictions in other cases, or they just presuppose answers to these questions. So what we want from something like game theory is not a statement of what the obvious answers are, but rather something closer to an explanation of why certain things seem obvious. Very good. So this is what prompts Bacharach and Sugden and Gold and others to introduce notions of team reasoning. And Bacharach says that team reasoning, the answer that he offers, has far-reaching implications for our conception of ourselves as social beings. So it looks like this is a kind of worthwhile thing to think about. Here then is the quote that I mentioned earlier, which gives you the very bare idea of what team reasoning is. So here's the most basic statement of team reasoning. Somebody team reasons if she works out the best possible feasible combination of actions for all the members of the team and then does her part in it. So Bacharach. Let's try and understand this a little more deeply. We can go a long way and get quite formal if you want to, but for now I'm just going to say, look, let's just really try and understand how this is going to work. The first thing we need to understand is, what are we talking about when we're talking about teams? And so here I'll switch to Sugden because I think he's very clear about this. Sugden says a team exists to the extent that its members take themselves to be members of it. So I think this is a very minimal notion of a team. If you and I take ourselves to be members of the Steve and you team, then we are members of that team and that team exists, and that's it. That's all there is to it. So this is a nice, very simple view. And furthermore, for you or I to take ourselves to be members of the Steve and you team is for us to engage in team reasoning while holding certain beliefs about your use and my use of team reasoning. Right? So that's interesting. So it's not enough that I just say, oh, I'm members of the Steve and you team and you say the same. We also have to engage in this kind of team reasoning. So what you notice here is that we characterize team by reference to the notion of team reasoning itself. So we've gone in a little bit of a circle here. I think this is virtuous. I don't think there's a problem here, but of course we still have to understand what team reasoning really is. And the key to that is to understand what Bacharach and others mean when they say best possible feasible combination of actions. What is it? What is the best possible feasible combination of actions for the team? Well, here it's Sugden who I think is clearest on this. So he says we should understand team preferences by contrast with ordinary individual preferences. So in the standard theory, he means ordinary decision theory, and of course game theory built on that. The individual appraises the alternative actions in relation to her preferences, given her subjective probabilities, her beliefs about how likely the actions are to bring about different outcomes. So in other words, as you saw earlier, the idea is that each individual calculates expected utility and chooses the action with highest expected utility, where expected utility is a matter of your subjective probabilities. What do you think the actions are going to do? What consequences will they have? And your preferences among the various consequences of the actions. By contrast, says Sugden, in team reasoning, you appraise alternative arrays of actions by members of the team, so sometimes called strategies or profiles of actions. There's a set of actions, one for you, one for me, one for anybody else who's a member of the team. And we appraise them in relation to, says Sugden, the team's preferences, team-directed preferences. Okay, so that doesn't really help us, right? We've gone a tiny step, we haven't gone very far. So Bacharach says, you choose what's best for the team, and Sugden says, well, that's a matter of what the team-directed preferences are. Now, of course, we need to know what are team-directed preferences. What are they? I'm glad you asked. And this is very short. At the level of the team, a team preference is a ranking of outcomes which is revealed in the team's decisions. So what's Sugden saying here? It's like this. If you ask the question about the ordinary individual case, what are preferences? The answer is given to you by that decision theoretic structure. Preference is just a construct of decision theory. And what the axioms of decision theory do, transitivity, independence, and the rest, is provide a connection between the choices that you make and the preferences that you have, so that if somebody observes you making enough preferences, they can draw choices, they can draw inferences about your preferences. That's the idea. Your preferences are revealed in the choices that you make. Now, it's not important from the point of view of decision theory that we actually infer anybody's preferences from their choices. That's not what it's about. The point is that by showing that the preferences can be revealed in the choices, we've demonstrated that the theory suffices to define what preferences are, as long as by preferences we want things which, together with subjective probabilities, explain actions. What Sugden is saying is that we can do the same thing for teams as a whole. Right? So we're going to take the team as a whole, observe the choices that the teams make, and then regard those as revealing the preferences that the team has. So in other words, for Sugden, it's a beautiful idea. We're just taking your ordinary decision theory, but instead of applying it to one individual, you're applying it to a team. And that's the only difference. That's the only difference. So for Sugden, team reasoning arises because we apply exactly the same theory, same axioms, not to the individuals, but to the team in order to get preferences for the team. So whatever you think preferences are, you just apply that same theory to the team. In other words, Sugden is being quite literal when he thinks that teams have preferences. He thinks that teams have preferences in just the same sense that other agents, you or I, have preferences. It's beautiful and it's simple. Now, there's an important thing to note here. There's a consequence of Sugden's view, and the consequence is something he calls autonomy. He says there's nothing inconsistent in the possibility that every member of the group has an individual preference for, let's say, high over low, while the group acts on an objective that has the opposite ranking, that prefers low over high. Or in Sugden's example, what's happened is a group of friends have started meeting in a certain pub. And so there's become a team preference to meet in that particular pub. Now, as the members of the team have grown older, they've got a bit, fancy, and they've decided each of them individually would rather go to a wine bar. But nevertheless, the group as a whole, the team, retains the preference for the pub. So the important thing here, what this is illustrating, the autonomy, is that your preferences and my preferences do not in any way determine the preferences of the Steve and you team. The Steve and you team may have preferences which actually conflict with ours, which leave you and I both individually much less satisfied than we would otherwise be. There are other things that would maximise for both of us our preferences. The team's preferences have this kind of autonomy. And that's just a consequence of the idea that we should take team preferences as just the same kind of thing as the individual preferences. What the team chooses reveals the team's preferences. What you choose or what I choose reveals our preferences, except when we're engaged in team reasoning. So if you've been following along this far, well done. Not easy to get this on a first pass. We've understood what Bacharach means by best possible feasible combination of actions. The best possible one is one that optimizes expected utility, but relative to the preferences not of me or of you, but of the team. The best possible feasible combination is one that maximizes expected utility relative to the preferences that the team has. Now you want to know, how does this help us with those high-low questions? So you remember there were two questions about high-low. One is, why does it seem obvious to everybody that you ought to choose high? And why do most people in fact choose high when they're presented with such a situation? And so here's high-low again. And the important thing to see here, as Sugden tells us, is that in team reasoning, we are no longer thinking of ourselves as engaged in a kind of strategic competition. Sugden says, one of the salient features of team reasoning is that it generates recommendations for action that are not conditional on the individual's belief about what other individuals will do. Right? That's exactly the thing that got us into the infinite regress before, you remember. So it's by avoiding that we avoid the infinite regress. In this respect, says Sugden, team reasoning is quite different from the strategic reasoning that's modelled in game theory. All right, very good. So this tells us two things. One is that we avoid the infinite regress, and the other is that team reasoning doesn't, all by itself, tell us that high is the right thing to do here. Right? There could be situations, according to Sugden, where low is the right thing to do because the team's preferences are autonomous of the individual's preferences. So what Sugden says isn't, look, there's some kind of rational explanation for why you should always do high, or it's obvious that you should go high. What Sugden says is that when the team's preferences make high more rewarding, then you play high, otherwise you play low. But in this picture of the game, we don't actually know what the team's preferences are, so there isn't really a rational decision to be made at all. There isn't really a rational decision to be made at all. So if we can answer, using team reasoning, that question from Bacharach, why is it that it seems obvious that you should play high? It's presumably because people think in this situation that must be the team's preference. That's presumably what Sugden thinks is helping us here. So here we are. We've had a look at what team reasoning is. This is only the first step. It's something quite difficult to take in at first pass, so if you've got this far, I do encourage you to think, I'll have a read probably of the Sugden 2000 paper listed below to see if I can really work out what it is. Once you've understood team reasoning, it's then time to go on and think about how it might help us with other philosophical issues like understanding the notion of aggregate agents or constructing philosophical theories about shared agency.